Chapter 9. Marta jotted down another note to Nick. He's scarier now than he was before. Like Marta and the rest of the class, Nick couldn't stop staring at Smoke. The transformation was incredible. Wendell Waxmo said, "You're tardy, Mr. Screwed." "Sorry, my bike threw a rod." Smoke set down his backpack and removed a thin plastic binder which he presented to the substitute. "Here's my essay," he said. 500 words, just like Mrs. Starch asked for. Actually, it's 508. A ripple of high amusement passed through the room. Wendell Waxmo opened the binder to the front page, upon which the title of the essay had been centered. The Curse of the Persistent Pimple by Dwayne Screwed, Jr. Wendell Waxmo made the foolish mistake of saying the title out loud, which caused an avalanche of laughter. "She told me to make it funny," Smoke said defensively. He seemed uncomfortable being so sharply dressed and the center of attention. "What kind of nonsense is this?" Wendell Waxmo rolled up the binder and shook it in the air. The tuxedo made him look like an orchestra conductor. "Are you telling me that Mrs. Starch had you research this paper on pimples? Get serious." Despite your teacher's hostile attitude, Smoke remained surprisingly calm. "Do you want me to read it now or not?" "Out loud, you mean?" Wendell Waxmo scowled. "I don't think so, Mr. Screwed. Take your seat." With a sniff of distaste, Wendell Waxmo deposited the Acme essay in his scuffled briefcase. Smoke sat down, to the astonishment of his classmates, produced a pen and a notebook. In all the time that Nick had known the kid, he couldn't remember ever him taking notes. "It's not really him," Marta whispered. "It's got to be an imposter." "Or a secret twin brother," Nick said. Dr. Wendell Waxmo seemed miffed that his limelight had just been stolen. He scuttled up to Dwayne Screwed Jr. and said, "Young man, I intend to find out if you're telling the truth about this preposterous pimple project, or if it's some kind of prank you thought up to get a few cheap giggles at my expense." Smoke looked puzzled. "Why would I do a dumb thing like that?" "Because kids always try to take advantage of substitute teachers, that's why. To prey on them, as if you think we're just here for a sport and entertainment." Wendell Waxmo inched closer. "I know your type, son," he said, "but I insist on respect. Why else would I go to all the trouble of dressing up this way?" Smoke shrugged. "Because you're a total whack job?" The class exploded, and Wendell Waxmo turned purple, and then he did something that caused the students to swallow their laughter. He jabbed a pale, knobby finger at Smoke's nose. "You," he said, seething, "owe me an apology." Nick and the other students fully expected Smoke to chomp the substitute's offending finger off, as he had done to Mrs. Starch's yellow pencil. But Dwayne Screwed Jr. shocked them all. He didn't nip, nibble, or even spit on Wendell Waxmo. Instead, he clenched his jaws, took a slow, tight breath, and said, "You're right, bro. I'm sorry." Which prompted Marta to jot another frantic note to Nick. "He's turned into an alien." If the truth were known, Dr. Dressler had the names of 4 other substitutes who were completely sane and normal. He chose Wendell Waxmo on purpose, instead knowing full well that he was out of his mind. It was Dr. Dressler's belief that once Bunny Starch found out who was teaching her class, she would immediately terminate her leave of absence and rush back to rescue her students. In the meantime, the headmaster braced himself for an angry phone call from the Truman parents complaining about Wendell Waxmo's distracting wardrobe, bizarre teaching style, and loony impulses to break out in song. For now, though, Dr. Dressler had a more pressing problem. "Would you care for some coffee?" he asked Jason Marshall. The detective said no thank you and took a seat. "Have you spoken to him yet?" The detective said no thanks. "Oh, sorry. Not a word. He just showed up for the class this morning," Dr. Dressler said. "Out of the blue. Did you notice anything different about him?" Dr. Dressler chuckled uneasily. "Everything about him's different. He's like a whole new person." "What do you mean?" the detective said. "He looks like a real student is what I mean. He looks like he wants to be here." "That's a good thing, right?" "Certainly," Dr. Dressler said, though privately he was both alarmed and suspicious. When the bell rang, he nervously poured himself another cup of coffee. "You'll see for yourself," he said to Jason Marshall. Moments later, Dwayne Screwed Jr. walked into his office. He didn't look like an arsonist. He looked like the future president of the student council. He also appeared perfectly fit and healthy despite having digested Mrs. Starch's pencil. Dr. Dressler introduced Detective Marshall. He'd like to ask you a few questions, Dwayne. No problem, Dwayne Screw Jr. made himself comfortable at the headmaster's leather sofa. Jason Marshall took out a legal pad. I heard about the incident with you and Mrs. Starch, he began. Dwayne Screw Jr. didn't deny it. It isn't against the law to bite a pencil. Some of the other kids said you also threatened her. She was making fun of me. I guess I got mad, the boy admitted. I told her she'd be sorry if she didn't get out of my face, and it was wrong, I said, definitely. So you didn't mean it? Of course not. Jason Marshall wrote down Dwayne Jr.'s answers. Dr. Dressler couldn't get over how normal the boy looked. He couldn't imagine what had caused such a dramatic change in grooming and attitude. Yet the next day you didn't come to school, the detective said. Yes, I skipped. That was wrong too, Dwayne Screw Jr. said. Have you been out to the Black Vine Swamp? Sure, catching snakes. Did you go there on the day of the class field trip? The boy seemed to be expecting the question. No, I went snook fishing down at Marco. There was a mullet run and a big tide. You can ask Benji Oscala. He was on the other end of the bridge. Dwayne Screw Jr.'s story sounded convincing to Dr. Dressler, but the detective wasn't finished. Dwayne, I'm going to ask you something, and you've got to promise not to get upset. It's my job, okay? No sweat. Did you sneak out to the Black Vine Swamp and set the fire to scare Mrs. Starch during the field trip? The boy was true to his word. He looked at Jason Marshall straight in the eye and said, I don't do that stuff anymore. So the answer is a no? Most definitely. Did you do anything during the last few days that might have frightened Mrs. Starch into believing that the threat was real? She hasn't been back to school since the field trip. Dwayne Screw Jr. laughed. That lady's not scared of anything, especially a kid. I don't want no more trouble from her, and that's how I got this stupid essay done that she wanted. Sorry, but it was stupid. Dr. Dressler felt obliged to ask, what kind of essay? Dwayne Jr. rolled his eyes. She made me write 500 words about zits. The headmaster winced. Seriously? The boy said. Dr. Dressler made a mental note to have a diplomatic chat with Mrs. Starch when she returned to school. Disciplining a student is one thing, humiliating him is another. The detective had heard enough about the Pimple paper. I'm about done here, he said. Thanks for stopping by, Dwayne. The boy raised from the couch. Just a second, I have one question, Dr. Dressler asked. Dwayne Screw Jr. turned, a trace of impatience in his eyes. The headmaster said, I'm just curious, Dwayne. Did something in particular happen to bring you this major change in you? What do you mean? Dr. Dressler smiled in a way that hope would appear friendly and genuine. The way you're dressed, the way you're acting, surely you're aware of the difference. Dwayne Screw Jr. looked down at himself and scratched pensively at his radish-colored blemish on his neck. I went camping for a few nights, had tons of time to think about stuff. What kind of stuff, said Jason Marshall. The way I was headed, mistakes I kept making, all the wrong turns. Even the detective seemed touched. That's just part of growing up, he said. Yeah, well, it gets old, the boy remarked, not caring about a darn thing in the world. So I decided I'm going to try it the other way. Dr. Dressler nodded sympathetically. Well, we like the new you, Dwayne. It's a solid move, Jason Marshall agreed. I guess, said Dwayne Jr. and excused himself. Dinner was a challenge. I should have made fried chicken, Nick's mother said. Something you could pick up with your fingers. It's okay. I need to nail this. Nick was eyeing the pork chop on his plate, trying to figure out how to cut it. He was able to work the knife pretty well with his left hand, but he couldn't make the meat from sliding around in his other hand to pin it down with a fork. Let me unwrap your arm, his mom implored, just for tonight. No way, this is how Dad's got to do it, right? Nick's mother said, I'd cut his food if he were home. You can bet on that. The disappointing news had come on the phone that at the afternoon, Captain Gregory Waters was fighting an infection in his wounded shoulder. The doctor had told Nick's mother that his dad was responding slowly to the antibiotics. On a more positive note, the doctor reported that Captain Waters' early rehab sessions were outstanding. Nick was pleased, though not surprised. His father had always kept himself in tip-top physical shape. How come they won't let him talk to us? Nick asked. Because he was sleeping. He said he did 2 hours with his left arm and a weight machine this afternoon. That sounds like Captain Studley. It does indeed. Nick's mom was watching the pork chops skate back and forth across his plate while he hacked it with a knife. You're going to starve to death, Nicky. Please let me do that. No, I'll get the hang of it. In frustration, he put down the knife, reached for a roll of bread. He gobbled it in 3 bites. It's only my first day being left-handed, he mumbled through his crumbs. You mean one-handed? His mother said. What'd the other kids say today? Not much. Marta thought it was pretty cool. How was PE? Fine, Nick said, which wasn't remotely true. Lacrosse was extremely difficult to play with your best arm behind your back, and Nick had been practically useless to his team. Later, while he was in the shower, two of his seniors had snatched his ace bandage from the towel rack and used it to hog-tie an overweight, slow-footed freshman named Pudge Powell IV. Two coaches spent 10 minutes unbinding the boy. So PE class was basically a disaster. His mom said, "You're going to be hurting tomorrow. You ought to take a hot bath." Nick didn't argue, though he was embarrassed to admit how sore he was. It wasn't as if he had been chopping wood all day. The routine task of taking notes, carrying a backpack, opening a few doors, and swinging a lacrosse stick had worn him out. Never again would he take for granted the luxury of having two good arms. After soaking for half an hour and rewrapping himself, Nick confronted his homework, which included 18 algebra problems. At one point, his mom came into the room and peeked over his shoulder. "I'm impressed. I can actually read your answers," she said. "I've got no idea if they're right or wrong, but I can definitely read them. Just wait." "Can I ask you something, Nicky? How long are you going to keep up this lefty routine?" "Until I get good at it." "Well, then what?" "I don't know what, Mom," Nick said shortly. "I haven't thought about that far." In fact, he had thought about it plenty. The doctor said that Nick's father would face months of outpatients rehab after returning home. Nick planned to be there with him, practicing all the same left-handed exercises. After finishing his math homework, Nick read an O. Henry story for English class, which improved his mood. Then he tackled the chore of brushing his teeth, causing only minor bleeding from his gums. He planned to go to bed with his right arm wrapped, but he couldn't get comfortable. His hand kept falling asleep, and Nick became worried the elastic bandage would cause permanent damage if he dozed off in the wrong position. With some effort, he unstrapped the arm, which felt weak and numb. He made a fist and flexed his muscles several times to get the blood circulating again. Nick already had the lights off and was listening to his iPod when his mother cracked the door, and she said, "Wow, it's only 8:30. "I'm wiped." She sat down and laid a hand on his forehead, checking to make sure he doesn't have a temperature. And he told her he was fine. "You're bummed about your dad?" she asked. Nick nodded. "Yeah, it sucks." "Well, we'll call him tomorrow, I promise." "The infection must be pretty bad." Nick's mother told him not to worry. The doctor said it happens sometimes after a combat amputation. The last word jolted Nick. The truth was sinking in. His father was an amputee. "But at least he's alive," Nick said to himself, "and that's what really matters." His mother said, "I'll be up watching TV for a while in case you can't sleep." "Thanks, Mom, but I'm ready to crash." An hour later, Nick was still wide awake. His body was exhausted, but his brain was sparking like a high-voltage wire. He couldn't stop thinking about the flash. Couldn't stop thinking about what had happened to his father, imagining the flash from the exploding rocket, the blast of the Humvee bursting into pieces, the flame of smoke and the screams. After what felt like he might dream if his eyes were closed, Nick grabbed his cell phone off the nightstand and dialed Marta's number, and she answered the second ring. "You awake?" he said in a low voice. "Just surfing Facebook. How lame is that?" "Extremely," Nick said. "You talked to your dad?" "Not today. He was in rehab." Marta said, "I can't sleep either. I've been thinking about everything that's been happening at school, and here's what I think. I figured out Mrs. Starch is a witch." "Oh, not this again." "No, I mean a real witch. Think about it. She and Smoke drop out of sight about the same time. Suddenly, he's back at school, and he's got like a complete personality transplant. I bet Mrs. Starch put a spell on him." Nick laughed. "This isn't Hogwarts, Marta. It's a Truman School." "I didn't say she's a wizard. I said she's a witch." "Whatever." "Okay, smart Alec. Let's hear your brilliant theory." "I don't have one," Nick admitted. "Something weird's going on, that's for sure." "Thank you," Marta said. Nick agreed that Mrs. Starch's excuse for taking a leave of absence from school, the so-called family emergency, sounded bogus. The woman hadn't missed a day of teaching since the Stone Age. Yet even more startling and suspicious had been the appearance in class of the new improved Dwayne Scrooge Jr. Alert, neatly combed and dressed, academically responsible. A complete stranger, basically. Nick had the uneasy sense of being in one of those short stories that led you off in a direction and then ended someplace else with a total surprise. And then the weirdness had all started on that day the smoke ate Mrs. Starch's pencil. Marta said, "Are you sitting down?" "Well, I'm lying down in bed." "Good. Guess what I saw this afternoon after school?" "Remember that blue Prius with the Save the Manatees license plate? The one we saw, just like Mrs. Starch's car?" "Well, guess what? It was Mrs. Starch's car. Had to be." "How do you know?" Nick said skeptically. "Because I saw it flying out of the parking lot out of Ace Hardware going like 55 miles an hour. And guess who was chugging a Mountain Dew in the passenger seat?" "Smoke." "Get out," Nick said. "Swear to gosh. In his Truman blazer." "Who was driving?" "Looked like a guy with a black ski beanie pulled down tight over his head. But I bet it was Mrs. Starch. You know, witches can change themselves into things," Marta said confidently. "Yeah, well, who changed you into a space case? There's no such things as witches, so knock it off." There was a silence on the other end of the line. Nick was worried that he had hurt his friend's feelings. Marta said, You don't believe me. I just don't believe in all the Harry Potter stuff, okay? But I do believe you saw smoke in the blue car," Nick said, "and I do believe the car belonged to Mrs. Starch. It's just too freaky to be a coincidence." Mark was relieved that Nick didn't think she made the whole thing up. "So what do we do now?" "Now," said Nick, "now we got to find out who's driving smoke around town in Mrs. Starch's car and what they've done with Mrs. Starch." Awesome. Although Nick stayed awake for a while longer, his imagination was no longer consumed by the Baghdad rocket attack that had maimed his father. Instead, now he was thinking about the Black Vine Swamp and what secrets it might hold. End of chapter 9.